Hello. I gave a talk at the local moot several months ago now, based around Greek mythology and philosophical concepts within ancient Greek religion, Hellenismos, as it's often referred to these days. And I was intending to make a recording of some of the ideas for the channel, but obviously life and mountains of marking and so on for work got in the way. So I'm going to make a recording now, touching on some of the ideas that were covered in the moot, though I'm going to try and make this a little bit shorter. I'm going to start with this rather cheap and cheesy visual aid. Because I haven't worked out how to make words appear on the screen when I'm doing a recording yet, so maybe somebody one day can explain that to me. So one of the ideas the idea I want to start with is the top one there, Mythos. And we'll come back to the other ideas as we go. Mythos is obviously where we get the modern day word myth and mythology from, mythological, etc., all the variations from that. Now, one thing that irks me is when people use the word myth in a dismissive fashion to suggest, that somebody says something and they go, that's just a myth, meaning it's rubbish, it's nonsense, it's made up. And that really is almost diametrically opposite the original Greek sense, ancient Greek sense of the word mythos, because mythos, in its early meaning, is a sacred story, a holy story, a magical, transformative, spiritually insightful story. It's not, in that dismissive sense, a bit of made-up rubbish. Some nonsense you make up on the spur of the moment to send your 10-year-olds to sleep at night when they want a bedtime story. It's not meant to be taken in that, it's just a story, it's just some nonsense. Mythos is meant to be holy. It's meant to be sacred. It's meant to be something special, something wondrous. And that's the idea I would like to get back to, that when we talk of mythos, whether we're talking in the Greek sense, the myths of ancient Greece, or you could equally be talking about the myths of the ancient Celts, the ancient Scandinavian peoples, the myths of the Romans, the myths of the Egyptians, the myths of the assorted African nations, or anybody else you feel like talking about. These are pretty much globally understood, or they were in their original contexts at any rate, understood to be sacred stories, rather than just some old nonsense to keep the kids amused with. And that's what I want to get back to, this sense of sacred story. Now, one of the concepts, and I'm pretty sure I probably have touched on this at some point over the years in past recordings, so forgive me if this is a little bit repetitive if anyone has heard one of the previous recordings, and if you haven't, it will be repetitive, so there we go. If we think of Christianity, if we think of Judaism, if we think of Islam, we have obviously religions with books, the Bible, the Quran, Torah, etc. And these books sometimes, or at least certainly not the whole book, but certain sections of the books are attributed sometimes to particular people. Matthew, Luke, John, etc. in the case of the Bible. And even where they're not attributed to very specific people who lived at certain periods of history in certain countries and so forth, they are nonetheless seen as having been put to paper. Somebody held that quill and wrote on that parchment at some point in the distant past and put these ideas down, and there is a notion that the people putting those ideas down were directly inspired by God or by Allah or by whatever significant religious figure a particular religion is focused on. Even, let's say, take the case of the Mormon Church, the notion that the angel Moroni presented a set of emerald tablets to Joseph Smith and he scribbled them out on a bit of paper, and then the emerald tablets were whisked off back to heaven and he was left with his paper copies of those emerald tablets. So the notion that these stories are either attributable to a specific person, and not just stories, because obviously these holy books often contain other things than stories. They contain poetry, statements of law, statements of morality, etc., prophecies. But these writings, in the broad sense, are often attributable to specific people. And there is perhaps a notion that someone had an experience, like the burning bush and the voice of Charlton Heston dictating what had to be done and what had to be recorded and passed on for posterity. Or the angel Moroni, or whatever it may be in a particular case. Within the set of religions that often get labelled as pagan, even if they didn't use that word themselves in ancient times, but these days we kind of have this habit of lumping them all together as if they were all much of a muchness. And there are certain similarities between them, in all fairness. One thing they frequently lack, which is maybe not the best way of phrasing that, which they don't have, is a founding figure. There is no specific person to whom it can be said, they, that man, that woman over there, they started this religion. They had the first set of visions, they heard the voice of a particular deity in the deserts, the forests, or the mountains, or wherever they were, and they came back to their people and they revealed their teachings to someone. Now, even where there are specific people, and obviously in the case of the Greeks you've got Homer and Hesiod, various others, they are not taken to be the originators of the story. They are simply one of the earliest known people to have committed stories to writing, but those stories are understood to have pre-existed Homer, to have pre-existed Hesiod, that they were recording, and maybe they came up with the poetic versions or whatever, so they put their own spin on it, but they were recording something that was common knowledge in their lifetime. And so they weren't the first, they weren't the founders, they were the, what shall we say, the perpetuators of certain stories, certain traditions, certain ideas. They put their version on it, as storytellers always do, put it in their words, their terms, but they were committing to paper something that was already doing the rounds, and probably had been for generation after generation after generation. So in these various cases, what we don't have is the first person to get the story. Now, when it comes to our notion of mythos, of a sacred story, of a holy story, I think there is a certain similarity perhaps between the modern day monotheistic religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc., and some of the pagan notions from ancient times, in that what makes a story sacred is frequently the idea that it is conveyed, or at least some parts of it are conveyed, from a divine source. So whilst some stories may be presented as recordings of historical events, this war took place, this king or queen was put upon the throne after a particular series of events, this plague happened, that happened, this happened, and what you have is a history, a recording of historical events. There's also a sense in which there are events taking place in periods of history where no humans are present, at least not humans in the sense that we understand today, or where the figures engaging in conversations, like a conversation between, say, Aphrodite and Hephaestus, to which no mortal would have been privy. So how do we know what that conversation was? Well, implicit in that idea is the sense that somebody, whether Aphrodite, whether Hephaestus, whether some other figure, must have relayed that conversation to some mortal at some point, and that mortal told somebody else, who told somebody else, who told somebody else, and it became part of oral tradition, and then at some point a Homer, a Hesiod, a literary figure of some sort, committed that story of a conversation to writing. Now, we've got various possibilities here. The atheistically inclined, or simply the slightly cynical, might say, well, it was just a made-up, this conversation never really happened, it was just made up by humans to convey something. And so it is a story in that slightly dismissive sense. But mythos is the notion that this story is not just made up as a time filler or as a way of teaching people about the changing of the seasons or whatever it may be. But rather that the sacred story is holy because not only is it about gods and goddesses and centaurs and dryads and nymphs and what have you, but because it is conveyed, or was at some point, in distant history conveyed within a spiritual context. So it could be that once upon a time, thousands of years ago, some mystic, some priest or priestess or whatever they were, went into a trance, had a vision, came out of their trance and conveyed that vision to whoever was sitting next to them, who told somebody else, who told somebody else, and it became accepted that this was a valid spiritual revelation, that they really had heard the voice of Zeus or Aphrodite or Hera or whoever it may have been, conveying some element, that these myths are almost like a kind of dictated divine autobiography. This is the gods and the goddesses, the Olympians in the case of the Greeks and other beings from other parts of the world, conveying something of themselves to a human audience in a way that the human audience will understand, be receptive to. And so there is symbolism, there is imagery, there's various elements within the story that may not need to be understood as a literal truth. This happened as a set of historical events, but rather it's conveying a meaning to the audience listening to it in a language that humans will understand. So when it talks about this deity is the sister of that deity, are they the sister in the same way that two human beings might be brother and sister? Perhaps not. Perhaps our notion of biological family is something being used by beings who are way beyond notions of biological reality to say the nature of my relationship to that entity over there is a bit like your brother-sister relationships amongst you humans. So, again, not to be taken as an absolute literal truth, but as a mythic truth, a mythos truth, a sacred truth that's conveying an image. Simply, whereas in some religions there are named people, so-and-so had a vision and this is his vision. Within the pagan context, whoever so-and-so was is so far in the past that no one can remember anymore. And I personally suspect that maybe that is a distinct feature of the pagan religions, in that the identity of the visionary, of so-and-so who woke up out of their trance or their dream or whatever it was that they experienced, is not important. Whereas in some religions it is important to know who had the vision, and that person becomes a significant character in the history, the story of that religion. Whereas for the pagan religions, the story is more important than the person who first woke up out of a trance and told the very first audience what they had heard, what they had seen, what they had experienced in this altered state of consciousness. And that absence of identifiable people is one of the things that possibly, being conjectural here, possibly makes pagan religions what they are. In that the human element is not as important as the mythical element in this case. So the telling of the story becomes a sacred act, and there are accounts that the Theogony, which is a story of how the universe comes into existence in Greek myth, and different aspects of the universe are created and so on. There was a notion that at the regular storytelling events and festivals that form part of the Greek calendar, that when somebody or other stood up and said, right, I'm going to recite the Theogony now, and the audience gathered round and they had a few glasses of Retsina or whatever they were on, and they listened to the the storyteller or poet declaimed the Theogony, that experience was transformative. It wasn't just, oh, we've got an hour to kill before the shop's open, what shall we do? Oh, let's go and listen to that old fart tell us a story. It wasn't a time filler. It wasn't understood in that context. It was understood in the context that this story is holy. And hearing the holy story is rather like going on a pilgrimage to some sacred place. And you get there and you drink the waters of the holy spring or whatever it may be, and your diseases are cured, your life is given new meaning, new purpose, new direction. There is something transcendent happening simply by parking your bum on a seat and paying attention. And I think that's probably the key point, that if you sit there with your finger up your nose, scratching your nether regions and letting the words go in one ear, rolling out the other, probably not a lot happens. But if you pay attention to the poem, the story, the Theogony in this case, then something transformative happens, because in the words the gods and the goddesses and the other beings come into existence. And it should be a profound experience, a transformative experience, storytelling at its most transcendent. That in telling the story of Apollo appears. Not necessarily in blinding golden light of some 20-foot tall Adonis and rippling muscles and a toga, but the presence of Apollo moves through the room. And in the same way, somebody might say telling a story from the Bible about Jesus could have the sense that Christ moves through the room, as it were, and the audience feel the presence of Christ. Or they feel in the presence of Shiva, or they feel the presence of Buddha, or whatever transcendent experience is going on, that the telling of the tale, if it's told properly, if the audience are engaged, has this transcendent experience. And it's not there to be critiqued in that, at the risk of offending some of the people I work alongside, often one of the best ways to kill the pleasure of a book is to do an English lit class and spend so damn long dismantling the story and ripping it into 1,000 pieces that you can no longer just pick up the novel, read it and enjoy it. It becomes a dissected experience. And you've got to critique it from a Marxist point of view, from a feminist point of view, from this point of view, from that point of view. And you lose the pleasure of reading the bloody thing in the first place. The myth, whilst you could sit and discuss, oh, does it mean this, does it mean that, does it mean the other, you kind of lose something in that lived experience of hearing the tale if all you do is sit there and put your critic's hat on and tear it to 1,000 pieces. Instead, what you're meant to do is flow with the story, move with the mythos, become part of the unfolding story, and let it change you. Some other occasion, you can sit there and do the criticisms and think, oh, it might mean this, and somebody else says, oh, no, I think it means that, and you have a bit of a banter, and you intellectually engage with the story. That's two separate things, the intellectual engagement and the emotive spiritual engagement. And I don't think you can really do both at the same time. Some of you may disagree and think, absolutely, you've definitely yourselves done both at the same time, and fair enough if you have. But maybe I'm just a very compartmentalised person, because for me, if I'm intellectually dismantling something and looking at it from historical angles and symbolic angles and this angle and that angle, I'm not emotionally engaging with it. And I think for this, the mythos experience, the sacred experience, you've got to park your intellect long enough to allow the story to work its magic, to have its effect on you, to transform you. Now, one of the things that we discussed briefly in the moot a couple of months ago is the idea that stories often get retold for commercial purposes. Some author who maybe has no spiritual connection to the story thinks, oh, I could knock out a version of this and sell a few books and make a bit of money, pay the mortgage. As an author myself, I'm not about to criticise that at all. Why not indeed? That's one of the absolutely valid functions of literature. But in retelling a story for, let's say, other than spiritual reasons, somebody thinks, oh, I'll do a version of this story in which I'll gender swap the characters, or I'll do a version of this story in which I'll set it in modern times and set it in a different country, or I'll do this, I'll do that, I'll do the other. They're treating it as a literary work. They're treating it as a piece of made-up fiction that you can fiddle and faff around with to your heart's content. Fair dues. What they're not doing is treating this as holy writ, as it were, a sacred tale, which has to be understood in that context. Now, what I've never been wholly clear of myself, and sadly I'm still waiting for Peter Capaldi to turn up in the TARDIS and whisk me back to a different period of history, so I can have the direct experience and find out. But in ancient Greece, we'll stick with, because we're talking about the Greeks, but you could apply this to any culture, was there only ever one version of a story? And I suspect the answer is no, because we do get competing versions of Egyptian creation myths, competing versions of stories about who exactly was the father or the mother of this or that character. So I suspect even in the day, let alone modern times, even in the day there were variant versions of stories. We're used to, after a couple of thousand years of monotheism, the notion that there is a truth, a singular truth, that there is one true version of a story, and any variation on that is a falsehood. And that's not something I think works terribly well in a pagan context, because you can have 5 versions of a creation myth, 6 versions of a family drama, and each has truth within it. Now, does that mean, going back to this idea of somebody having a vision in a trance and waking up and repeating it, that each, let's say you got 5 versions of a story from ancient times, does this mean that there were 5 different visionary experiences, and this person over there in that century had one vision, and that person over there 300 years later had a different vision, but from the same inspired by the same deities, revealing different truths or revealing it in ways that this tribe would have understood it if the story was told in that way, and that tribe would better understand it if the story were told in a different way? I suspect personally that is what was going on, that there was a sort of, I don't want to use the word revelatory experience, but an attempt to convey meanings to different groups of people, different periods of time, different cultural backgrounds, in ways that they would have understood. And because quite a few of those different versions were written down, nowadays, 21st century, we can read competing versions, or what looks like competing versions, of the same story, and we think with this sort of slightly conditioned notion that there ought to be one truth, not 5 truths, that one of them must have been the original version and the other 4 are just poor secondary accounts and not as of much worth as the first original true version. I think rather that we are in the realm of mythic truth, where the imagery has to click with the audience, and if one audience might click with one set of imagery, but another audience might hear that imagery and go, what? Don't get it. But they would get it if it were put in a different way. And so these are multiple ways of conveying notions, conveying experiences. Does this have to have stopped? So coming back to this literary idea there, so you've got a 20th, 21st century author who thinks, oh, I'm going to retell this old myth, but I'm going to retell it my way and put my own spin on it, and they go off at tangents. Are they doing a disservice to the original sacred story by treating it as a commercial property that they can just fiddle with and milk for a bit of sales? Or are they themselves having a perfectly valid insight and interpretation into that same truth, but they are being guided, perhaps, at a subconscious or collective unconscious level, if you want to be a bit Jungian, into repackaging the truths of the story for a different culture, a different audience who will respond to different images. I think there is an element of that goes on. Other times it's probably just somebody who commercially repackaging a story and there's no great mysticism about it. They just think, oh, yeah, I'll do it this way. I suppose it depends where the idea for the story comes from. Is it from somebody having one of those light bulb moments where they wake up and think, oh, the muse has grabbed me and I'm going to do this? Or are they just thinking, oh god, my publisher wants something by next Friday, oh, I'll do that. And they're dashing something off in a slightly less than inspired manner to play on Queen Victoria's joke. They are unamused. There is no muse presence in what they're doing. So that's an idea. Now the next on the list is arete. And arete is an intriguing idea because it overlaps into things like modern day positive psychology, which I teach in module on, and into philosophy and various other ideas. Arete is a central Greek virtue, a central Greek value that seems to have cropped up in ancient Greece. Was a collection of city-states. It wasn't one unified culture. The Athenians had their way of doing things, the Boeotians their way of doing things, the Thessalians their way of doing things, and so on. But arete seems to have cropped up in a variety of different contexts with a noticeable consistency. Arete is to do things as well as you can do them. And that as a notion, of course, is not confined to the Greeks, because you can find similar ideas in other cultures. They just use other words to describe it. It's to be the best you can be at whatever it is that you do. Now, it's not value-laden in the sense that it is saying activity A is preferable to activity B. It's not saying, being a brain surgeon is better than being a dustman. It's in effect saying, if you're a dustman, be the best dustman you can be. If you're a brain surgeon, be the best brain surgeon you can be. If you are a tap dancer, be the best tap dancer you can be. And it goes hand in glove with another concept down there at the base, hubris. Hubris is where you kind of miss the point, I suppose, really, with arete, because arete is to be the best you can be, not, which is where it slides into hubris, which is, to use a Judeo-Christian term, a sin, if you like, or a failing, a weakness, is to try and overshadow, I should say, outshine, overshadow other people. So if I'm writing a poem and the person next door is writing a poem and I want my poem to be better than the person next door's poem, I am engaging in hubris, because all I'm interested in is outdoing them. I'm not engaging in that activity to be good at it. I'm not engaging in that activity to be of benefit to someone, help the community, make the world a better place. I'm engaging in it for egotistical reasons. I want to be the big I am, the big celebrity, the big star. I want to be better than somebody else, and in effect I'm going to grind them in the dirt to overshadow them, to say, you're nothing, I'm better than you. And that's not a good motivation. That is hubris. Hubris in the myths is often very much geared towards hubris against the gods rather than against other human beings. So Arachne boasts that she is better at weaving, spinning and weaving, than Athena, the goddess in charge of such crafts and skills required around the home. And Athena says, right, if you think that, and transforms her into a spider so that she's doomed to spin forevermore, hoist upon her own petard. The gods don't like to have jumped up mortals claiming to be better at things than they are. But in truth to any of us, I suppose, at the end of the day, if you're trying to do something and you've got some overbearing bore who goes around telling everybody that they're so much better at such and such a thing than you are, and even if it's true, even if they genuinely are better at that type of an activity than you are, it's still a very galling, very unpleasant thing to have somebody going out of their way to overshadow you, outshine you, shove you into the darkness to be forgotten and ignored and cast off as irrelevant. So arate is when you try to better yourself. Now in sports psychology, which ironically I used to teach at one point, you wouldn't believe it to look at the state of me, but there is a notion of being, a notion of flow, of zone. It's also not just used in sports, it's used in other activities as well, but particularly in sports psychology, where those psychologists who subscribe to this notion, this concept, recommend to their clientele, or whatever the proper terminology would be, that last time you scored 3 goals, this time I want you to try and score 4 goals. So rather than saying, I want you to do the other team down, beat the other team, last time you completed this race in 2 minutes 50 seconds, I want you to try and complete it in 2 minutes 45 seconds this time. It's to say, do better than you did last time, rather than do better than that other person. Overshadow them, outdo them, grind them into the dirt, you be the winner. Now obviously in sports you don't necessarily get the big money and the gold medals just because you did better than yourself last time. You get the gold and the gongs and the money because you've ground the other team down or the other competitors down, and you've won and outdone them. So you know, the structure is often to encourage a bit of hubris, but the psychology, the idea behind zone, is that if you can get someone so focused on the moment and skills and accomplishment and doing what they're doing, like in archery, they're so in the moment, they're at one with the bow, at one with the arrow, they've got the target in mind, everything is flowing, they're in the zone. What they're aiming to achieve in that moment of flow, where they are so in the period, in the minute, in the lived minute, is to be the best archer, best marathon runner, best footballer, best tennis player, whatever they are, that they can be in that moment. Not to think of the other players, not to think of the competitors, not to go, "Ooh, they're doing better than me, I better run a bit faster, better do this, better do that," but to be so focused on their own performance that everything else kind of phases out. And they accomplish what they accomplish. Now, they may possibly win the game outright, but even if they don't, if they do better than they did last time, that is a significant achievement. As I say, it won't necessarily get them big money or anything like that, but it is argued to be a more mentally, emotionally fulfilling experience without the stresses and the pressures of having to do better than everybody else. And there's an awful lot of sort of stress-related mental problems, depression, suicides, etc., within the world of competitive sports for people who are either buckling under the pressure of having to constantly win or living in constant fear of being displaced by somebody younger, fitter, whatever, because they are no longer focused on their own performance, they are focused on everybody else's performance and whether or not everybody else is better than they are. So arate is to be as good as you can be and not to worry about how good other people are who are doing the same task. Doesn't matter if their cake tastes nicer than your cake, so long as the cake you've made now is better than the cake you made yesterday. Because you are immersed in the moment, you are focused on your task, you're enjoying it, hopefully. You're concentrated on the experience, and your aim is just to get better at what you do, to do that task to the best of your ability, which isn't wholly the same thing as getting better. But if you're going to bake a cake, bake a good cake. If you're going to you're a carpenter and you're going to make a chair, make the best chair you can make. If you're going to be a doctor treating a patient, be the best doctor you can be. To do whatever it is that you do to the best of your ability. And to be focused on that, not worrying about other people and what they're doing and how you're measuring up to them, not worrying about wanting to grind them down or that they might grind you down or any of that, but to be there and focused and to do a good job. Because the other side of arete is that if you don't bother with it, if you don't kind of follow it as a concept, then you do a sloppy job. You think, oh well, that'll do, whatever. And arete is very much opposed to that whole kind of, should we say, philosophy, if you can call it that, of whatever, where you just do any old rubbish, sloppy job. You don't really care about it. You just think, that would do, and you're on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. Obviously, we've all had days when we're probably feeling tired and under pressure, and you've been, if you're in employment or whatever, or even just doing household chores or something like that, where you're doing something you don't really want to do, but that will do, and you kind of do a slapdash job of it. It's not, from this Greek philosophical point of view, it's not the ideal way to a fulfilling life. And perfectly understandable at a human level that we all have that experience. But the more you do it, the more common it becomes to keep doing it, for that to become a habitual pattern. And obviously that's part of Aristotle's argument that we are what we repeatedly do. So if you repeatedly do a sloppy half-assed job, then you become a sloppy half-assed person. If you repeatedly do as good a job as you can do, then you become a proficient, enthusiastic, engaged person, a committed person. Now, what you achieve might not live up to somebody else's standards, but part of arete is to effectively say, well, screw them, because you are living up to your own standards, not to somebody else's barked orders who sets a bar for you to jump over. It's a route to personal fulfillment, to personal happiness and contentment, to achieving eudaimonia, the good life, the happy life. That is part of the step towards that. And eudaimonia as a concept is that notion of all people's lives. And certainly Greek culture, ancient Greek culture, has features to it that would make most modern day 21st century liberal Westerners very uncomfortable. Attitudes towards women, attitudes towards slavery, etc. But there were counter movements. People who, like Pythagoras, who allegedly had a very educated wife and ensured that his daughter was extremely educated, to the point that when he died she was able to take on board the running of his philosophical schools, who believed that slaves, if they had promise, should be educated and ultimately obviously freed at some stage, because not all ancient Greeks were in favour of slavery. Some of them saw it as a very destructive, negative thing. So there were movements, even in ancient times, to have much more compassionate approaches to all sections of humanity, and not to treat some sections of humanity, whether that was women in general or slaves or the working classes or what have you. Not all members of Greek society wanted to treat certain groups of people in a very snotty fashion. So when I talk about eudaimonia, the pursuit of the good life, if we're being up front, then quite a lot of ancient Greek philosophers, when they talked about the pursuit of the good life, really meant that only certain people should be pursuing the good life, and really who cares about various sections of humanity who are or were deemed as less capable of having that good life. Whereas what I'd suggest these days is that we should broaden the good life, the eudaimonia, out to the biggest possible audience. That we can take inspiration from the ancients, but update it to reflect changing modern values. That we no longer regard half of humanity as inferior to the other half of humanity. We no longer regard slavery as a desirable institution, although disturbingly there are, according to various charities, there are now more people enslaved in the world today than ever were in the 16th, 17th century. And scandal after scandal about various multinational companies building their massive profits on the back of slave labour. So obviously it still goes on. But where we have this aspiration to get rid of it entirely. So eudaimonia is something that, at least in theory, everybody could attain to. What constitutes a good life, the Greeks are quite aware, varied from one person to another. What is a pleasure for one person may not automatically be a pleasure for another. But a consistent element that creeps out in Greek philosophy is the sense that joy should not be brought at the expense of another's misery. So if I like painting pictures, I can paint pictures and enjoy doing it. Nobody else suffers. Oh, I suppose some people might look at them and go, "Oh, that's rubbish." But per se, nobody suffers in the process of me creating art, painting pictures. However, if Fred West gains his pleasures and jollies from molesting and torturing people, then clearly the people who get molested and tortured are suffering for the attainment of his pleasure. And the ancient Greeks would have made, or some of the philosophers at America would have made the argument that that therefore cannot be true pleasure. Obviously he's probably laughing his socks off and enjoying every minute of molesting and torturing people, but a distinction would have been drawn by the philosophers between fulfilling joy, pleasure which brings benefit to the person doing it, potentially to other people as well, and causes no harm, causes no suffering, and those forms of pleasure that very much do cause harm and suffering, and therefore are not eudaimonic moments, they are corruptions rather than fulfilled expressions of eudaimonia. It's something that long time later the Scottish philosopher John Stuart Mill reiterated with his notion of the harm principle. He was thinking a little bit more in legalistic concepts and arguing a few centuries back now that the government of the day, or any government indeed, should not be going around making up laws and rules and regulating what other people do if what they do does not cause harm. Now, it may be a little bit odd, it may be a little bit peculiar, it may not be to everyone's tastes, but if it does not cause harm, then there should be no laws or rules against it. And so he was a fairly radical early voice who thought that the laws against homosexuality should have been repealed on the basis that if two men or two women are enjoying themselves, let's put it like that, in the privacy of their own homes, who else is being harmed? He felt no one. Therefore, why have a law to stop people doing something that's not harming? The law, he felt, should only intervene in activities where somebody clearly was being harmed and against their will. Like the Fred West case, yes, he might be enjoying it, but he's causing harm, therefore absolutely the law should step in to stop him. Because it is not a eudaimonic form of pleasure. It is a very selfish, very cruel form of pleasure. And certainly the notion of the good life, of the eudaimonic life, is one that seeks to move away from selfishness. That pleasure is something that should cause no harm, something which the person engaging in it, in the pleasurable activity, obviously would need to enjoy, otherwise it's not pleasurable if they don't enjoy it. And even more ideal if they can share it to bring pleasure to other people. So if other people look at the paintings I've knocked out and go, oh, that's nice, or if I, not that I can't play any musical instruments, but if I could, and somebody else could listen to it and enjoy it, then the pleasure is shared, and therefore it becomes sort of more eudaimonic, as the happiness, the goodness, the joy of life is not just a self-indulgence, it's a shared experience, a communal experience that at least one other, if not several other people, can partake in and take joy from, and the goodness spreads. And from that Greek perspective, the fact that I would potentially know I've brought joy to somebody else by playing the piano or whatever it is I'm getting up to, that would add to the personal joy that I would be experiencing from engaging in the activity. So it's bringing joy upon joy, and that's something to aspire towards, something to aim for, from a Greek philosophical point of view, that it becomes a move towards a more benevolent experience, a more shared experience, a lived good that ripples throughout the world. It's kind of gone slightly off the tangent from talking about mythology, really, isn't it, to more abstract philosophy. But there we go. So it's that move towards concepts of pleasure and happiness, and again the hubris element, coming back to that. If your pleasure is partially derived from deliberately knocking somebody else into second place, in pushing somebody else into the shadows, into irrelevance, to say it's not enough to say, oh, I've achieved this and I'm so happy I achieved this. The added pleasure comes from saying, well, I've ruined your happiness in achieving this. Ha 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 ha. That's an added sort of frisson, an added thrill. That is part of what makes it a corrupted pleasure. That the joy should come from just, I've achieved this, not from saying, I've overwhelmed somebody else in the process. I have bested them, I have done them down. That pleasure in causing unhappiness to other people, which seems to be a large swathe of what constitutes social media these days, is a corrupted pleasure, is an unpleasant, degraded pleasure, and rather it should be pleasure from saying, I have brought happiness to XYZ many people, rather than I've brought misery to XYZ many people. I think we'll end it there. We'll pick up, I'll do another recording and pick up on Eusebia and a couple of the other concepts I want to talk about. So we'll do this in 2 parts, and I'll end this part here. It'd be interesting to see if anyone's got any thoughts or feedback or ideas they want to share about their own understanding of mythos or arete and hubris. Eusebia, sorry, not Eusebia, eudaimonia and the good life. We'll build on from there. Anyway, thank you.